Well, I suppose we could start out by saying that we've been coming down the island as kids for years, and so I sort of knew the area. We'd been spearfishing here and things like that, and we were living at another place in Phillip Island, and we just happened to come past here one day and see this block of land for sale, and I looked at it from the front there and I didn't think much of it because you couldn't see the beach from the front, so I thought, oh, it's probably just a land block or something like that. Anyway, we were back a couple of weeks later and we were down the beach, and I decided I'll walk up and check out this site, and you know, I walk up and I couldn't believe it, you know. I sort of walk up from about here somewhere, and there's the whole view of the beach. So we raced down to the real estate agent and sort of said, yeah, we want to buy it. So we bought it, and I guess it's when I walked up here, it's exactly as you see it. It's fantastic because you're elevated just enough that you're high enough that you can get a really good view. But you're close enough that you can see the waves and you can see what's going on. It's a frame view with a headland on either side, so you've got country, you've got ocean, you've got the whole bit. And there's not that many houses around here. It's a 10-acre block, and so, you know, how could it not resonate? I guess we had another house as I said, over the other side of the island. That was just a little timber shack that I designed and since been modified out of existence. But I guess we'd also been, as a practice, we'd always been interested in landscape design and siting, the way buildings are sited, the way they're approached, all those sorts of things. And I was sort of conscious that, you know, we'd spearfished at all these beaches, and there's nothing more irritating than going to a beach and you look up from the beach and there's this great two-storey house sort of looking down, taking over the whole beach. So in a way, it's not that I'm sort of super green or anything like that, or sort of so worried about the environment, but I really did want to do a house that didn't jump out at you, that actually just sat into the landscape, so that it just blended in. And I think partly all that's tied with the fact that I think just the way I approach architecture anyway is I'm always looking for a simple solution. I mean, it doesn't have to be this simple, even if it's got form, it tends to be very simple. It's not complex and complicated, which probably says something more about my brain than than anything else. But so basically what happened, I did exactly what you'd imagine, walked up the site, stood where you thought where you'd be able to build the house, 40 metres from the shoreline, and stood there and said, okay, look out to sea, this is the way you'd point it. I knew it was going to be a single-storey house because I didn't want it to jump out. I knew you probably couldn't build a two-storey house anyway down here, because at that stage I think the state government had taken over the powers of the local councils who were letting everything happen, and they were a bit more careful about it. So basically, and then I started thinking about the materials, what I'd make it out of, how I'd blend it in. Concrete seemed like a good idea at the time. I didn't realise just how expensive a concrete house is, which is very expensive when you're doing off-form concrete. It turned out that there was a concrete plant 2 kilometres up the road, but I didn't know that at the time. Nothing as intelligent as that. I found that out later, so that was coincidentally, that was quite good. So a low house, and in fact, trying to build it into the landscape, there actually weren't any dunes. This is actually on clay here. This is very clay, the soil. And the dunes just came up to the edge of the house on the western side, and they'd pretty well stopped before the house begun. So what I did is I set it at the right height so that I could actually push the dunes, collect the topsoil that was from here, push the dunes into the side of the house, so that way it looked like it just sort of naturally slid out of the house. And then I guess I was thinking about, well, go on, I'll probably answer all of your questions in answering the one question. it was trying to fit it into the landscape. There's some great rocks out the front beach there that are all black basalt rocks. So I thought pigmented concrete, black pigmented concrete would be good rather than that sort of ordinary concrete that tends to go a dirty sort of yellow colour. Black's a great or dark grey's a great colour for camouflage, to sort of just blends into the background, you just don't notice it. Stick a bit of grass on the roof and no problem. Yeah, it wasn't, I didn't pick concrete so much because of its durability, if you like, but basically because it was going to be set in the ground. So concrete was then the obvious starting point. And I've always been interested in, I guess, metal. I know as kids we used to make spear guns, and we'd make guns and things out of metal, and we'd file metal and we'd drill it and we'd rivet it and do all this sort of stuff. And I sort of like, I guess it's sort of turned out that I like architecture that you can actually sort of understand how it's built. You can see the pieces that it puts it together. So I wanted to use sort of, you know, just a really simple palette, just the concrete and then sheets of galvanised hot dip steel, and it's as though you bring them in, you bolt them together, you assemble the things. And of course it's also good because it's the sort of stuff you can do yourself. You obviously have to get the sheets made and cut and to size and galvanised, but then you get them in and you can actually just assemble the whole thing. And of course it takes forever to do, especially when there's only one of you doing it and you've got no one to do the lifting. We've had some tense moments over the years, me and Rainey, where I'm saying, just hold the sheet. She's, I can't hold the sheet. So I've learnt not to do the heavy things when get a friend around.
When you need help.
When I need help, yeah.
And on weekends too.
And on weekends too. And then the only other materials really used were the terrazzo, the dark terrazzo floor. But what I did want to do in the bathrooms is, I thought it'd be quite nice to reverse things, so that you've got the black floor goes up the external wall and goes across the ceiling, and then there's a white U shape of sort of in the other direction of the aluminium panel, so that there's a sort of a sense within the cave, if you like, that there's a few places that are properly, if you like, properly in inverted commas finished with a sort of a slightly finer level of detail in it. So, I mean, once I decided that it was single story going to sit in the dunes, I didn't want it to look, I wanted it to look like it was a plate that had been inserted in the landscape. So rather than, if you can imagine, obviously it was natural that you would wedge up from the side that way, run across the top and then wedge back into the dunes at the other side. I didn't want to sort of bring a wall out and make it curve around the landscape, curve into it. So I wanted to see like it was an insertion into the landscape, which of course it needed to be, because then I wanted to continue that slope all the way around the courtyard. And then what I also wanted to do was to not be too formal in the landscape. So what I did was place the windows, which probably talk about later too, is not look at it as though it was an elevation from the outside, which you tend to do as an architect. You tend to look at it and say, well, how will this look like so-and-so? And there's a little bit of compromising on the interior. So what I simply did is I said, okay, I'll take the living room and I'll put the window where it should be in the living room. I'll take this where I want a veranda and I'll do this here. The laundry only needs a small window. The other two bedrooms, they can have a sill at a low level so you can see looking out of bed. The first bathroom only needs a small window that's just a nice little, like a painting on the wall. Our bedroom a bigger window, so on and so forth. The other bathroom going right down to the floor, because the bath goes down the floor, and it can have a low ceiling height. So it was sort of like trying to see it as from the inside out, like a painting from the inside out, so that there was a painting on the wall, it just happened to be the ocean. And from the outside you get this pattern that really window heads don't line up, things don't line up, but it makes it, therefore, even though it's obviously architectonic, it does make it seem not so regimented, so formal. And then the inlays, the dots that I was going to put in, they were meant to emphasise even more that sort of the fact that the windows were out askew, because the dots would be sometimes quite close to the windows where they shouldn't really be if you were planning things properly, because they were laid out in a regular grid. And so now what I've got left is just the memory of the dots, where the dots would have been, which was the insert that I put into the concrete. What I decided to do, again, comes back to the drilling holes in the floor and doing things like that. I had a bit of a preoccupation, I suppose, at that stage, I mean, you've got to remember that was in the days of postmodernism, when they were decorating surfaces and things like that. And I quite liked the idea of putting inlays in, so inlays of stone that were special, sort of because they were stone and coloured, into this raw concrete wall, and using them to give it a sort of a texture without giving it texture and a pattern. And it's not a bad idea, I guess. I thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll put orange dots, because when you go out in the out on the headland there, you've got the orangey coloured lichen. It's quite bright, actually. And I thought, well, maybe I'll get some orange stone and I'll put the orange dots in on the ocean side to link back through there, and that would have, and I had them at 300 centres, I think, from memory, on the bedroom end, and 600 centres on the living room end, so you could distinguish which was the living end of the house, which was the bedroom end of the house. I mean, I think of all these things and they're just, I don't know why you do them. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, about your sanity. And then on the inside I said, well, I'll make those all the pale green, like there's also the pale green bushes that are out there. So the courtyard will have the pale green ones in them. And as sort of time went by, I just decided, well, I liked it better. I liked it better the way it was. So that's the way it stayed. Yeah, the stone, it would have changed the character, but I've wondered about that, and of course you don't know. I mean, I think it's better, it's lucky that I didn't do it. I think it would have made it maybe just a bit too decorative now as I look back. At the time I wouldn't have been worried about it, but I think you couldn't help but see it slightly differently if you can imagine, particularly in the courtyard, if I had all those inlays in the courtyard, it would make that courtyard, on the one hand you could say maybe a bit more precious, or a bit more as though it wasn't just a concrete wall that you've obviously thought about it hard and decorated, if you like, spent time sort of doing something with it. But now I like it the way it is. I like it just raw and sort of austere, so I'm happy that I didn't do it. Again, my simple brain at work, I like a simple house plan. And Rainey she did want a house, I suppose partly because we had a fairly small house in Carlton. She wanted a house with a separate living room, which is sort of unusual for a holiday house. The normal thing you'd think, you just have a room like this as a family kitchen, sort of dining room. So she wanted a room that she could close off as a separate room for the living room, so that became the room at the end. Then naturally you string the kitchen, family dining area to it. I wanted to get, because I wanted one little break I was prepared to make out of purity, if you like, of the long rectangular slither, was to put a little bay window out the side to catch the light, because we like the sun. We like the sun coming in. I like to be hot, and I like the sun coming in winter. And when we were in this other place in Cowes, it was in amongst the tea trees and didn't get much sun, so we wanted a place that we could get in the sun. So we had that little bay window that you could catch the sun. Then you follow that by the laundry, naturally enough, and then you follow that by a couple of bedrooms with a bathroom in between them, and then you get down the other end, you've got your master bedroom. So, and what that does is it puts your living room and your master bedroom at each end. That allows them to have a window that faces the ocean of the south, which is the southeast, but also another window that goes back into the courtyard, which then faces the northwest. So each of those had the big rooms had the windows on the edge. Then this room, of course, has the two-way sort of more amorphous space. And then the two second smaller bedrooms, they have the big pivoting doors that can open out. So they get, although the corridor would get, or the passageway would get some light, I also put some very small windows in down the passageway that didn't focus your attention on the courtyard, but actually made it a transition space between the living space and the bedrooms, and got light into the passage. Yeah, well, people talk about, you know, the light mostly because they've seen photographs of what John Denton called the penguin windows in the passage, and to be honest, that's almost a bit of a coincidence, I suppose. I mean, I'm obviously conscious that, you know, windows will cast shafts of light in there, and I get shafts of light from these in the morning because the east sun in summer comes across through here, so you get the shafts of light from the columns in the veranda. But there in particular, what I was mostly interested in was, I think I said earlier, is I was trying to make, in the house generally, the reason the courtyard was there in the first place even was, and it's a sort of a crazy reason, but it seemed a good idea at the time, was I didn't want the house to just be sitting in the landscape. I wanted to feel it, from one side it was just a wall in the landscape, but from the other side I just couldn't imagine that it was like a wall on the other side and you drove up a driveway and there was a wall on the other side. It didn't seem enough, because I guess as a practice we've always been very interested about entry and arrival and things like that. And I sort of like that idea of, in country places, that you have the homestead place and you have the sheds and the things, and they form a complex. It mightn't be as formal as this, you know, this sort of thing is like one of those English type places that they used to had those gardens that. And to be honest, I'm digressing here, but at one stage I did think the courtyard, maybe I thought one day it might have an olive grove in it, or I might grow vegetables in it, or do something in it, but, you know, I came to love nothing in it. And, but I wanted to make the distinction between the ocean side and the other side. And so when I was walking, when you're walking down the passage, I didn't want to make too much of it. But from these rooms here, what I didn't want you to sort of start this side or that side, so that you were looking only at the sky from the sky. You really only got a sky view from this sunny side. And so it always pushed you back. You're always very clear about why you built the house where it was. It was the ocean that's the important thing. And I've got enough countryside on the ocean side anyway. And of course it was all pretty scruffy in those days. There was a couple of scruffy houses on the back there, and it was all open. There were no trees because I planted trees in the background and stuff like that. So it was very bare and open, and I guess I was trying to, as I say, just focus attention on the ocean. Yeah, well, yeah, I'm happy with it. I must admit, I was young, I didn't think about those sort of things then. But it has. What I was mostly worried about, I suppose, when I did it, was that maybe the concrete would go sort of pale and start to look scruffy, and you know how ordinary white or standard concrete does get that sort of dirty, ochre-y sort of stained look. So I've been really pleased that the pigment has stood up to it. I like the way the walls have sort of started to get sort of lichen sort of on the top and starting to grow down the walls, so they're changing. I like the way the galvanised steel is weathered, so that some places when you look at it from the outside you can almost not pick the galvanised steel from the grey concrete. It's quite surprising. What I don't like so much is that even hot dip galvanised steel starts to rust in places after 30 years when the water doesn't get to it to wash off. So I've had to try and patch up a few bits and pieces. Other than that, I've had a few problems with leaks as usual. They always happen where the outlets are going. I just have outlet pops going, and they've got a little bit. I'm just digging them up at the moment actually. I've got to patch them up, so I get when it rains really heavily. What you learn in these sort of places is that because of that such a narrow building, you get a negative pressure on it. So what happens is that when the wind comes, say, from the ocean side, you get a negative pressure on this side. So if there's the tiniest of holes or the tiniest of gaps, what happens? It sucks water through. It actually sucks through. So the water doesn't leak through, it sucks through. So what happens is they've just given up around the outlets a little bit. So obviously what happens when the wind's in winter coming from the west, it makes a negative pressure on this side, which means that any little holes here, and believe me, there's plenty of air gaps in this because this is a custom designed house that you'd never get away with now. It sucks the air out of the house and draws the water down through the tiny little holes. Just on that, yeah, that is one of the things that I've realised over time, is that, see, there's no double glazing in this place. You'd have to do that now. And all these windows, these big sliding doors and windows, they're all sort of designed by me, so they're not a standard section with proper seals and all that sort of stuff. So I've got weather seals all over the place that I've stuck in, and you know, pivot doors. The back door, that's a pivot door. Well, a pivot door is a disaster for trying to seal. So I've got rubber strips and seals and things around them. But I mean, it's okay if you lived here all winter. It might start to get to you a little bit. I think it might get a bit cold, but it's got electric heating in the floor, which that was a good idea at the time because there was no gas. But I mean, I sort of a joke that I reckon when I turn the electric heating on, the lights dim on Phillip Island. So we're very frugal with our electric heating in the floor nowadays. Now the electricity prices are through the roof. So that was something I probably wouldn't do again either. So. I don't know, you'd have to ask someone else whether they'd like to live here. I could imagine maybe someone who was very interested in architecture and prepared to put up with a few compromises. Look, it's not that hard. It's not, it sounds like it's hard to live in. It's just not an ordinary house to live in. It feels quite cosy in winter if it's warm. But if it's not warm, it doesn't feel cosy at all. In summer, it can get hot because it's concrete walls. There's no insulation in them. So the black concrete on the north face here, it soaks up the heat. Now that's great in winter because it warms it up and then it gives off heat during the night. And it does. You can literally feel the wall actually as you walk down the corridor giving off heat during the night. I had intended, one of the things I had intended to do, and again it's another thing I never did, and that would have changed the character enormously. There's some little slots all the way around the wall. They've still got bits of wood in that I've never taken out. I was going to cantilever out some, about 1.5 metres, some steel flat plates, string wires through them and grow grapevines all the way around the outside of the house so that it would shade this north wall and make it again a more cosy. This was when I was thinking it was a more cosy sort of a courtyard. And I actually did try to grow the grapes, but what happened was they'd get to a certain height, and because I didn't have a sprinkler system in at the time, they'd get up to about 1 metre, and then summer had come and the concrete water gets so hot, the grapes are just, they couldn't go any further, they just died. So I gave up on the grapevines. And again, I think it's one of those things I'm glad I didn't. It heats up a bit, but it sort of feels tougher and stronger not to have the vines around. In a broad sense, it'd be nice to think that someone might buy the house who wanted to keep it the way it is, but it would take a special someone, because it's just not your average house to live in. You know, there's lots of hard edges and sharp corners and things that aren't 100% perfect. And I'm pretty sure from talking to real estate agents and people like that, if this house was just sold, I wouldn't mind betting the first thing they'd do would be to bulldoze it. Yeah, down here, they'd knock it down, because they'd try and put up a 2-storey one. And it's just not, I was telling you a story before no, I didn't tell you a story. I was thinking of a story. the neighbours put a house up on the dunes there, and this is a few years ago, and they decided to put up the rates on all the houses around here, because the house sold for $1.7 million or something after it was up there, so they wanted to put our rates up. And so we rang up the council and said, look, can you know, we don't think we should be paying more rates. It's only a simple house, and we're paying enough rates now. Can you send a valuer around or whatever? They have an assessor comes around to look at it. So anyway, the assessor eventually came around, and he came, you know, he's looking around, and he said, oh, I see what you mean. He said, yeah, it's not really finished, is it? It's and you could see he was actually feeling sorry for us that we were living in it. So they put the rates down. They did put the rates down. So I guess for your general public, this isn't your normal house. And people usually, the comment usually when they're not architects, they come and they look around, they say, wow, that's a great view, isn't it? You know, and they sort of very careful not to comment about the house. We were living in it, but I was working on it, and it was a rainy day. And lots of people used to come up particularly when it's getting built. They'd wander up, you know, because the surfers are out there on the break. So everybody in Ireland knows about it. It's known as the bunker, and they all know the house, that mad house out at Kittymill Bay. And anyway, we're in here, you know, we're in here sort of doing something. This guy wanders up the track here. You see him look, and he wanders up the track. It's raining. He comes and he stands on the veranda here. So I sort of go out and I say, oh, excuse me, mate, this is a private house. He said, I thought it must have been a public toilet. He said, I come up here to... So that's what people associate black concrete houses with. I was talking a little bit about it earlier. I think it would be quite a different place if you didn't come in via the courtyard, only because it sets you up to sort of begin to understand the house. If this house was just, it's hard to imagine, but if it was just a bare strip in the landscape from both sides, and you saw it before you got here, it's not particularly special or something. I don't know what it does. It sort of gets you ready for it. And it's like, I think you were saying to me earlier, that when you were looking around the house, you felt you hadn't even seen the house. You'd arrived because we haven't walked out the front. So it isn't actually a house at all. When you approach it, it's simply a place that you go to, and you walk through some doors and you're into an interior. So there's no sense of house as such, which I quite like. I quite like the idea of. So. And of course, you could have done that, I suppose. You could have planted trees, you know, and waited 15 years for the trees to go and made some sort of courtyard and sort of contained it in that way. But I just like the idea of you come in the driveway, you can't see anything, but the drive goes straight ahead, and you're looking at the house skewed at 45 degrees, and you can just see the hint of the two sloping walls that just mark where you go. And people are quite surprised. They drive their car in and they've arrived, they're here, and they can't sort of get their head around it. It's only when they sort of walk in and see the view and say, wow, this is a great view, that they've arrived. It's more that this is just part of a process of DCM works, I guess, that our interest in landscape, in setting buildings into it, of trying to downplay buildings, or where we can. I mean, obviously, designing an office building, it's a different thing than a house or an embassy or something like that. But in a direct sense, or probably the nearest direct influence has been on the sheep farm house that we did up in where there was a courtyard of sorts that happened after this place, where this idea of arrival, but that was like an open courtyard, open on one side. But I don't know that, you know, it's not as if you design something, or we've never designed something and said, wow, well that one worked really well, we'll do another version of that. Because all the houses that you do are all sited, they're sited differently, you've got different clients, they want different things. So bits of them rub off. But I suppose the best way to explain it is if you look at the latest house that we've done, well, John's house, John designed, is the house up at the Yarra Valley, which is, it doesn't blend into the landscape. It's just two sticks at right angles, but in fact, it's exactly what we're on about in a different way. It's sitting still it's like a, if you like, a slightly less quiet object in the landscape, but this is just a wall in the landscape, that's two sticks in the landscape. So they're just, we've always tried to do these things as much as we can as a sculpture. It's almost like a piece of sculpture, a bit of land art in the landscape, where we can. And when it's a city building, it's in the city landscape, and even there we've generally tried to downplay it and sort of see it as more an object or a series of simple forms rather than a complex shape. I can't imagine building a house that's got walls going everywhere and angles in it and slopes, and it's just not what I do. I mean, it's not that I don't like those sort of houses or don't admire them, but they're just not for me. I don't, well, look, I don't know. Look, what I can tell you is it's interesting. Neville Quarry, before he was the Dean of Architecture at Melbourne Uni, and the house was, when it was only just finished, or not even completely finished, we had an exhibition at the Architectural Biennale in Venice, and the house was in it. And John Gollings came down to do some photographs of it, and I remember we went, we hired a boat over at San Remo, and we sailed around all the way around it. We're out on those rocks there because we want this shot from the water, sort of the house just sitting in the landscape. And the guy in the boat had his sounder on because we were right where there's some rocks out there, and it was rough. It was a day like today, and the boat was going up and down. He was really worried about it. Anyway, we got the photographs, but the point of the story was that Neville Quarry, who'd organised this exhibition sort of thing, amongst other things, he said, I suppose I better come and have a look at this house. He said, I haven't actually seen it. And honestly, it's because you're saying I'm modest. No, I'm not modest. I'm just got as big an ego as anybody. But he came, and I was almost quite embarrassed because it seemed to me the house was just too simple, not complicated enough. And he was fine about it. It wasn't quite as finished as it was now, but he was fine. He said, no, he sort of saw what it meant, which was sort of reassuring because when I did this house, I really never thought of it being, becoming well known. And it's funny, it's being published in so many places, not because it's great architecture or anything, it's sort of in a strange way, it's because it's interesting. It's sort of underground way before a lot of houses were underground. It seems environmental, and it's sort of simple. And you know, when photographers come, guys from Arbitrare came, I think they were the first ones to photograph it. And you could see they came in, they were all excited. They were so excited because it's all simple. You know, you're photographing light and shadow and planes and simple forms. It's not the normal sort of thing that you do. And so that was sort of reassuring when people liked it. That no, you wouldn't do it. You couldn't afford to. There'd be too many court cases. It's like we don't even let relatives stay here because there's too many. You realise there's too many things. There's too many sharp corners. There's too many things that people can walk into in the night. It's a terrazzo floor that's unsealed. You spill orange juice on the floor and leave it, and you'll have a white patch on the floor because I didn't want to seal the floor and get it all sort of glossy. And so it is sort of. It seems easy and like you say, well, what can go wrong? But it's what goes wrong to the people that I'm worried about, that walk into the sharp corner or stand up under that overhanging bench there. A little kid stands up under the overhanging bench and caves his head in, you know, it's sort of on the sharp stainless steel corner. So, I think one of the nice things about a holiday house, and particularly nice for yourself, is that you can do things that wouldn't necessarily be sensible or practical in a permanent house. I mean, it was an experiment. I mean, literally, I wondered what it would be like to live inside a house that was dark. And I thought, well, you know, because everybody expects it to be white, sort of, and woody and holiday. And I thought, but you think of all those English houses, the 18th century houses, all those sorts of places that had dark timber panelling and dark walls and stuff like that, and people managed to live in them okay. And of course they probably decorated a bit more, and that's why I used the bright coloured furniture and things like that. I thought you can have just these objects, these bright coloured objects that you're allowed, you can then place in it, and they become the, if you like, the highlights, and everything just becomes a neutral backdrop. So, and it works, it's fine, it's fine. I suppose I always think of those sort of architects as they're like real architects, those guys that were doing it deliberately, but maybe they were just often guys like me that were just sort of, things seemed like a good idea at the time, you know, use of lightweight materials or whatever it was. Because I think there's an awful lot, I mean, I know there's some architects, like Sean Godsall, you know, Sean's a sort of an absolute purist, and I can't imagine Sean not ever thinking about architecture, and it was always going to be the way he wants to do it. But I suspect a lot of architects are just sort of, things happen, you know, and there are people like Sean or Seidler or the Boyds of the world that really do have a, if you like, a plan, an idea, and I tend to sort of drift along, and as I say, things seem like a good idea at the time, and I just do it that way. And the only plan, as I was saying earlier, that I've had, or that I can now recognise, is this idea about crafting things and making things in metal and being able to understand things because it's the way I would make them, and that's the way I plan buildings. It's all as if it's something I can get my head around. That's why they're not so complex, anything I do.